Hello, everyone, and happy Palm Sunday 2020. I'm so glad that you've chosen to join us on this journey through Jesus' last week on earth as we study Mark chapters 11 through 15 and walk with Jesus as he makes his way from the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday to the crucifixion on Friday. We're going to be looking over 6 different lessons in this series of who is this man called Jesus. When we think about Holy Week that we're beginning right now, it gives us an opportunity to really dig into our relationship with God and who we are in relation to him and who he is in relation to us. It makes us think about the gospel, which we know means the good news. The good news about what? Well, the good news about Jesus. And that leaves us to that question that we're going to be asking throughout this entire series: who is this man called Jesus? It's a question that everyone must answer. And as we look in Mark, as we go through the 6 days from the triumphal entry to the crucifixion, we see 6 different aspects of who Jesus is. And it's something that we can learn for our own understanding and for our own relationship with him. And so I'm glad that you've chosen to join us on that. So today we're going to start with our first lesson, which is going to be found in Mark chapter 11 and the first 11 verses. This is the arrival of Jesus at Jerusalem in the week leading up to the crucifixion, the last week of his life here on earth and his first advent, his first coming. And we call this passage that I'm about to read the triumphal entry. It is when Jesus enters Jerusalem, coming in to the city, welcomed by people who are proclaiming him as the returning Messiah, and they're waving palm branches and laying down their clothes for a path for the colt that he's riding on. He is welcomed with open arms into the city. So let's read this passage. I'm going to be reading this out of the New Standard Revised Version, and it starts in Mark chapter 11, beginning with verse 1. When they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it and will send it back here immediately.'" They went away and found a colt tied near a door outside in the street. As they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, "What are you doing, untying the colt?" And they told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. And many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So what we see in this passage from Mark is the triumphal entry, the coming of Jesus into the city of Jerusalem. And I want us to focus on verses 9 and 10. The words that the people who were gathered with him were shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." These people are not just saying these words in Jesus' day out of nowhere. They're actually quoted from one of the Psalms, Psalms chapter 118. And it was a psalm that was to be sung in worship with all aspects of the ancient Jewish state, with the king, with the priests, with the people, all worshiping God together. And so it was known as a psalm that recognized the arrival of the King of the Jews. And in this same passage, what we see is actually a fulfillment of prophecy. It's not just people in Jesus' day shouting Hosanna, but the fact that he comes into Jerusalem riding the colt of a donkey. This was a very lowly entrance. It wasn't an entrance that was made in pomp and circumstance. It was a humble entrance. Jesus was coming in a very lowly state. And this actually is the fulfillment of a prophecy in Zechariah chapter 9 that the priests of Jesus' day could not understand how the Messiah, the promised coming king of the Jews, would accept such a lowly, humble entrance. But in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, that prophecy reads, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So what we see as Jesus comes into Jerusalem is an actual fulfillment of Zechariah chapter 9. To the letter, coming in riding on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So it was an opportunity for the people in Jerusalem of that day to see the fulfillment of that prophecy and recognize that Jesus was the Messiah. And so what we see in this passage, the first aspect that I want us to understand of who Jesus is that through the triumphal entry in Mark chapter 11, verses 1 through 11, we see that Jesus is king. Now, I want to point out several things about that. It's more than just that Jesus is king. I want us to see that the people rejoiced. They shouted, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The everyday people of Jerusalem recognized that Jesus was the Messiah, and they honored him as such. But I want us to understand that the people's acceptance and their rejoicing did not make Jesus king. Jesus was king already, and their rejoicing did not change that. He was already king, and he would be king whether they rejoiced or not. We have to understand the nature of what a king is. Now, we live in a democracy, and things are different. We have a republic where we elect our leaders, and so we don't have a king, we have a president, and we change that president every 4 or 8 years. And when we go through an electing process, and that person only becomes our leader if they are chosen by the people to be that leader. But Jesus was not a president. Jesus was king. And that's what we see through the fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy and through this recognizing that the people made in Mark chapter 11, shouting Hosanna. They recognized that he was king. They didn't make him king. They recognized that he was king. A king is not elected. A king is not chosen. A king is born. Jesus was born to be this king. He was going to be king whether the people accepted him as king or not. And he is king today, whether we accept him as king or not. When we look in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, again at that prophecy that this triumphal entry was a fulfillment of, it says, "Lo, your king comes to you." That's what the prophecy was about. Your king is coming to you. It's not saying choose this person as your king. It's not saying when you see someone coming in on a donkey's colt, then you should choose that person to be your king. He said, no, your king is already king. He just happens to be coming to you in this way so that you can recognize that fact. And he says on in there, he says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem, because the king is coming to you." You should rejoice. You should shout. You should, in another word, accept his kingship. Place yourself in willing obedience to his rule. If he is king, then obey him as king, is what Zechariah is telling the people of Jerusalem. So when they shouted, "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord," they are accepting Jesus as that Messiah, as that coming king. And we too are faced with this same situation. We cannot choose whether he is king or not. Jesus is king regardless of whether we choose him as king or whether we ignore that fact. What we must choose is how we stand in relation to him. We have a choice between two options. He is king, so we can choose to either be a loyal subject of that king or we can choose to be a rebel. That's really our only options. It's not to choose whether he is king or not. It's whether to choose that we will submit to his kingship. This is actually a situation that we're all faced with a question that I've always found interesting at the end of the story that we're actually not fully going to get into in this study. But in Mark chapter 15, verse 12, Jesus is before Pilate, just before the crucifixion. And Pilate tells the people, "What do you wish me to do with the man you call the king?" This is in Mark chapter 15, verse 12. And Pilate's talking to the people, what do you want me to do with this man who you call your king? And that's the question we have before us. What will we do with this man who is king? Will we accept him as our king? And in doing so, what that means is to place ourselves in obedience and submission to him as king. Or will we remain in rebellion? Man went into rebellion at the fall in the Garden of Eden when they disobeyed God. Adam and Eve fell, and through the inheritance of sin, we all have fallen short of the glory of God. But we have an opportunity now, if we accept Jesus as our king and we place ourselves in obedience to him, to come out of that rebellion, to become loyal subjects once again. We're faced with this choice, and Jesus himself offers this choice to us. In Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30, Jesus gives an invitation, and I'm reading this one out of the King James Version. And he says, "Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." This invitation is an invitation for us to submit ourselves to the rule and reign of Christ in our life. He says, take my yoke upon you. If it's his yoke, it's his control and his direction over our life. Just as an ox or a mule that's in a yoke is directed by the farmer who is plowing the field, whichever direction that farmer wants to go, when we take the yoke of Jesus upon us, we are submitting to his direction and his guidance. And he says his yoke is easy and his burden is light. He is a gracious and benevolent king. And if we will submit ourselves to him and not remain in rebellion against him, then we will partake of that easy yoke and that light burden. It makes our life very easy in going forward. Not that we won't ever have difficulty, but just as an ox or a mule works throughout the day pulling the plow, but then is fed and is sheltered and is taken care of throughout the rest of its life, likewise Jesus protects us, and he feeds us, and he nourishes us, and he gives us shelter from all the vagaries of life. And we are able to be strong in his yoke because we have submitted to him. Now you may say, well, if I'm not part of Jesus' kingdom, if I haven't accepted him as my king, that doesn't mean I'm a rebel. Well, really it does. We really only have two options. He's either our king or we are in rebellion against that rightful king. In John chapter 3, we all know John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life." But if we go on from that, and we get into verses 18 and 19 of that same chapter in John chapter 3, he tells us there, he that believes on him is not condemned, but he that believes not is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. What this passage teaches us is that if we do not choose to accept the light of Christ's rule, then we are condemned already. We have chosen to remain in rebellion against him. We're faced with this option. Take the yoke that is easy and light, or remain in rebellion. Jesus even closes out his word, the Bible that we have, in the last book of Revelation, in the last message to the last church in Revelation chapter 3. He gives us another picture of that invitation to be a part of his kingdom. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 20 and 21, he says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and will sup with him and he with me. To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am set down with my Father in his throne." This is another extension of that invitation to accept Christ's rule over our lives. He says, I stand at the door and knock. I'm offering myself to you, my kingship over you to you. Will you accept? Will we open the door? He says, then I will come in and he will sup with me and I with him. We will have a relationship. We'll have fellowship with Christ. But then in verse 21 he says, to him who overcomes, I will grant to sit where? In my throne with me. His throne. He is the king. He reigns upon the throne, and we are given a chance to be a part of that reign if we will accept his kingship over us. So if you happen to be watching this and you've never made that full acceptance of Christ as your king, as the one who has the right to rule and reign and guide and direct and lead your life, then I encourage you to accept that invitation that Christ is holding out to each and every one of us. Will you accept him as your king? And will you choose to bring yourself into willing obedience before him? And if you already have made that choice, if you are a loyal subject of the king, then I ask yourself, examine your life. Is there some area of our life where we're not being as willfully obedient to our king as we should? Is there some place we're holding back? Is there some area of our life where we could be more submissive to his direction, to his guidance, to his will for our life? And if so, then I encourage you through prayer, through Bible study, through fasting, through fellowship, through confession, through meditation on his word, to find those areas and to strengthen your obedience, to strengthen your submission to the king. Because that's the invitation we have on this Palm Sunday. He says, I stand at the door and knock. He says, I offer my yoke to you. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. Will we do that? I encourage you to take the yoke of the king upon you today, because that's what we learn in this first lesson of who is this man called Jesus? He is the king. He was the king before we came about. He will be the king after we're gone. He's king whether we accept it or not. So will we choose to submit ourselves to his rule and reign? I encourage you to do so. Tomorrow we'll go on with the rest of this study. And if you want to go ahead and look ahead at that, we'll be in Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 19 for the second part tomorrow. And as we depart today, I want to say thank you for watching. May God bless you and keep you, and may his face shine upon you and carry you through this holy week as we learn more about him.